This is MJ. I am enjoying Captain America comics very much, and actually, what I'm enjoying more than that is the freedom that I feel in going from comic to comic. I last reviewed a Fantastic Four, and the next one's going to be a Fantastic Four as well. I think the next issue I'm going to review should be Fantastic Four issue 2, but for now, I'm just going to talk about Captain America issue number 2, which came out supposedly in April 1941. At least that's what the Marvel Unlimited app tells me. So I actually watched a bit of a history lesson, a real short one that I'm going to get into after I talk about all the fun stuff in this episode. And so anyway, first I want to talk about the cover. The cover of the very outside of, there's actually 4 Captain America stories in this. It's got, Hitler on it, Bucky's tied up, and Cap's there, going to fight him or whatever. And then there's a splash page for the second story that has Bucky on his hands and knees, and he's knocking over, he's there for Cap to knock Hitler over, like schoolyard kids would do. And that's kind of funny. And that's going to get into what I wanted to talk about in this episode, but I'll get to that in a minute. And then the last one is it's kind of a so-so splash page. They probably figure you were into it already. If you've gotten, 38 pages or whatever in through the 2 stories, that you're going to go ahead and read the, Captain America and Bucky versus, the Waxman issue. So anyway, looking at this book as a whole and thinking about where it fits in the context of actual history, I think is important. You may want to dismiss it as silly, but I don't think you can, because you got to think about the fact that these books were coming out, in real time, and they were, basically propaganda type books at this time. It wasn't Marvel Comics; it was Atlas Comics, or was it Timely? Oh crap! I think it was Timely, and then they eventually became Marvel. But anyway, they wanted to help, stoke support from American citizens for World War II, and for getting involved in World War II, and that was not an easy sell, because World War I was very brutal. Lots and lots of Americans, lots of other people died, but this is an American comic in America propagandizing Americans to join World War II. So it's important to note that World War I was devastating, very, very bad, and people wouldn't want to get into it. But if you put it in, I don't know what they called them, I guess just the comic strips. If you put it in a comic book magazine, and you have a superhero running around fighting, it might be inspiring, it might be encouraging. Honestly, I don't know how effective it was, because eventually we did get into World War II based on the Pearl Harbor bombing. And if you want to learn more about that, I suggest you check out was it not a Renegade History, although that would be interesting too, but the other book. Anyway, I'll talk about the comic now. I feel like everything in these comic books, especially this second one, really hits its stride, and I think gels into like what you can expect from Captain America comics at this point. Is that it's like a really interesting and really dynamic and like alluring power fantasy. You've got this U.S. agent. I think she's an agent of the government and not just a reporter. She's packing heat. Her name is Betty. I think her name is Betty Ross. Betty Ross, kind of like Betsy Ross, the lady who sewed the flag. I think it was the 13-star Continental flag of the early United States as they were fighting against Britain. I believe that I'm correct in that history. But anyway, she's a blonde lady. She was dressed and designed to be a beautiful character. She's like running in heels, and she ends up getting attacked by this, green Asian-y monster, because I believe the axis between Italy, Japan, and the Germans had already formed by 1941. So when they were going for, making these, enemy characters, they decided they could use some Asian characters. I think it just calls them Oriental giants. So, for a person back at the time, Oriental, that's Asian, that's Chinese, that's Thai, that's probably, like anything, Burmese even. So much of it is, Oriental covers such a broad swath of humanity that at the time, I think this was an easy thing to go for. Like, oh yes, we're gonna, even Chinese, I don't know if I said Chinese, but anyway, the compelling thing was like, hey, we're Americans, the Nazis are working with these Oriental folk too, and they're working to undermine our our country and the strength of our government, and they're inhuman. And I think the effectiveness of the propaganda is, again, I'm arguing that it's strong. I wasn't there at the time, and I don't know that Captain America comics are what got us into World War II. I doubt it, but I'm sure it helped for enemies of the United States to be personified as inhuman. Even Mr. Han, who's this wealthy guy who's using the Oriental giants to, I guess, amass more money to himself, he's kind of a stereotype too. But more importantly than like vilifying, so I guess there's two steps for propaganda, or for effective propaganda, and I do think it works. Me as who I am now, living 78 years after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and stuff, and long after World War II has ended, like I have a different perspective, and I can just have fun with these comics, even though like might disagree with them for what they are. At least for the subtext of like, we should be going to war and we should be attacking these monstrous foreigners who are others and who want to hurt us in these deep and profound ways. But the thing I can appreciate is that they did it by creating Captain America. He instantly had Bucky as a companion, and Bucky's like a 13, 15-year-old boy, and it took us, I think, 2 years to get actively involved. So somebody reading this as a 15 or 16-year-old could have easily gotten in, and someone who was a 13 or 14-year-old could have lied about his age and gotten into a draft office and signed himself up to go fight like Captain America and Bucky had. So that's pretty interesting. But there's a lot of really fun elements in this. You don't really get to see the cost of the war. Bucky is like just the mascot of the military base Camp Lehigh, I think is what it's called. Lehigh, I think it's Lehigh, Lehighgh, so that should be Lehigh. Anyway, and Rogers is, he's not a sergeant. I don't know what rank he is, but it doesn't matter. The two of them like have fun. They just have fun on the base. They have fun having these adventures where they're fighting Nazi sympathizers or Nazis themselves, guys coming over from Germany with awful stereotypical German accents that are a delight to read, and then some Oriental folk too. And it's very effective because it's all punchy and bright and colorful, and you get silly gags like the fact that the two of them dress up as a grandmother and her grandson in order to go to France to track down this scientist who has been abducted by the Nazis. Like, it's such a bonker plot, but the comic just blithely goes along with it, and it's actually a lot of fun. So the ideas behind the comic really work well. I like the dynamic between Cap and Bucky. It almost kind of reminds me of like the Shazam idea, where it's a power fantasy about a kid becoming, a Superman, an Ubermensch, if you will, and being able to, have these great adventures or whatever. Because Bucky does a surprising amount of damage to the enemy. I mean, he's just a boy. Like, maybe he's a very fit boy, but he's got daring and gumption, and somehow with his 100 pounds, 120 pounds maybe at the most, he's able to check people, full-grown men who are much larger than him, and kick two of them at the same time, and all these different things, and it really does devastating damage to them, even though it shouldn't, because he has no superpowers, and that's just kind of funny. So besides all that, I love how many of the action scenes involve breaking panels. So like Bucky flips this guy over, and then he runs into him to kick him, and that breaks panels. There's this beautiful shot, which is just so fun and exciting, where Cap and Bucky both slug these German, these Nazi guys, or whatever. I don't know. It's a complicated thing. Were they Germans? Were they Nazis? Were they German Nazis? It's hard to tell, but they're definitely German guys. Anyway, these thugs and foot soldiers to whoever it was. I think these might have been the Waxman's friends, or stooges. Anyway, they punch them, and the guys end up cracking their heads into each other as they're crumpling to the floor, from the devastating blows of Captain America and Bucky. And it's just a lot of fun. I actually read this over the course of a couple days, and I read, because it's 3 distinct stories, and I ended up reading the second story to my baby. Like I just had the comic there in front of him and was flipping through and reading, and he didn't enjoy it because he doesn't get it, but it was like really enjoyable to read. It was fun to read aloud. It was fun to do the I don't know if they'd be considered racist or not, but the German accents. I've got nothing against the German Volk, but it was very fun to Ach, dies Captain America und his pal Bucky. Like it's a ton of fun. And it's interesting how all these years later, it just gets to be something fun. But I think probably at the time, it was something that was enjoyable, and because it was entertaining, it made for even more compelling propaganda. But I don't want to just talk about it being propaganda over and over again because that's kind of boring. It was just these were quality comics. No, not quality comics, but they were good. They were a lot of fun, and I enjoyed the different stories. Like some of it was wacky. The stuff about the scientist getting captured was weird, except for there was this one great shot of him being tied to a wooden stake, and they were going to blast him with a cannon. The cannon is like 10 inches from his face. And then Cap and Bucky pop out of there after they've somehow diffused it. And like you don't even see how they do it. It happens. And then there's this fun short story that's a little bit more like a novel, or it's a short story. It's just text with one image. So I forgot to see if is it Simonson? It's Kirby, Jack Kirby, and Joe Simonson, right? Or Joe Simon? Anyway, I can't remember. I didn't check who wrote the short story, but it was very good. It was compelling. It was very pulpy. It was interesting because it gave you like an insight into how Cap was feeling, but also like what his superpowers are. Like he has really good hearing, superhuman hearing basically, and just like his senses are heightened. Even his eyes, he can see really well in the dark and things like that. And that was a lot of fun to check out, or to experience. Also, hats off to Kirby, of course. This amazing artist. He made really awesome German like driving tanks that were like train cars almost, and they look really awesome, very imposing, and that was super fun to watch Cap and Bucky go up against, and they get inside of one and they disarm it, and then Bucky's driving it around and he like thrashes the Nazi camp, or the German camp that these came from. That was really cool. But one of my favorite images from the whole comic was where Cap is blocking shots from the German like super tank, I'm gonna call it, and he's blocking it with a shield, and just the way, like the energy and the dynamism in the panel are really like awesome. It made like I called this like a anti-Nazi power fantasy, and it really did feel good to see, good to watch, and it was like, I don't know, like it feels noble and heroic, and I should give the context. Camp Lehigh is being attacked, and like tents are being run over because the soldiers are in tents, and they're like being murdered by being trampled or crushed basically by these vehicles, and Captain Bucky, they suit up real quick, and then they go to save their fellow soldiers, and just, I don't know, it's like, it's great heroism, and it just looks so cool, and it looks so good. It's really inspiring. Even if even if you want to be critical of war propaganda, like it does a really good job of it, one, and two, the deeds and the actions that are happening are noble and good, and it's just so admirable, and I don't know, kind of encouraging of like, hey, I should be more heroic too. Not that I have a big shield or superhuman strength or anything like that, but if I did, I would use them. Anyway. I think that's all I wanted to say about the comic proper, but I did want to talk about the timeline of World War II just a little bit, just touch on it briefly, because I think it's important. So I found this information at actually I don't remember the name of the YouTube channel, sorry, it was like Mahalo something, looked like a Hawaiian guy, but the video is entitled Learn History, a Timeline of World War II. Learn History, a Timeline of World War II. And I'm not going to give you the short URL because that's ridiculous. I'll put it on the screen, but I won't say it. Anyway, it was very interesting. It was only like 3.5 minutes long. And basically, I have it written down. I need to go grab my papers right now. Okay, so here's my timeline, and then I'll state the timeline, and then I will kind of analyze it. So 1939, Germany and Russia invade Poland together. Then in 1940, starting in April, Germany invades Norway, France, Luxembourg, and Holland. In May of 1940, Churchill becomes Prime Minister of Britain or England or the United Kingdom, whatever the heck you call it, because I really don't know. And then, he wants to be he took over for Neville Chamberlain, who basically wanted to roll over to Hitler, and Churchill was much more willing to fight him. Then on September 15th of 1941, there's I think it's the start of the campaign of Leningrad, which I don't know what that is, but it's in Russia. I think maybe at that point is when Germany turned against Russia, because the Russians ended up killing a bunch of more of the German military than everybody else did, but a bunch of their guys died too, so interesting. Then December 7, 1941, just a couple months later, Pearl Harbor is bombed. Who was the president at the time? Was that Roosevelt? He provoked the attack. Look it up. It's true history. It's not fake news. Check it out. Just something they don't like telling kids because everybody loves Teddy. Even though he interred a bunch of Japanese, much like the Orange Man is doing now. Anyway, much like he's accused of doing it, I should clarify. Anyway, 1942, the Doolittle raids happened. Then June 6, 1944 is D-Day. That's the invasion of Normandy. A bunch of U.S. troops went there. I don't know who else. I think it was mostly an American thing, but I don't know my World War II history that well. April 30th of 1945, Hitler commits suicide. August 6th and 9th, Hiroshima and then Nagasaki are bombed, and then August 14th, the Japanese surrender, so that's 5 days after Nagasaki was hit, and that's called VJ Day, for Victory Over Japan Day. And let's see, I believe the U.S. was not involved. See, Doolittle, I could have sworn, no, Doolittle was British, I'm pretty sure. I don't believe the United States was involved in World War II until 1943, actively, even though we were bombed in Pearl Harbor. We were bombed in Pearl Harbor for, and Captain America came out in March, starting in March of 1941. So, a good, 8 or 9 months before, probably 9 or 10 months before Pearl Harbor was bombed, Kirby and Simon were already working on the Captain America books, the character, all the other aspects of it, who he would fight and whatnot. And it was a couple of years later of, anyway, I think probably in 43 is when Kirby ended up getting drafted and going into World War II, and he fought in Europe. So that's pretty interesting. But I mostly shared that because I just thought it would be interesting historical context. I don't think at all that Captain America got us into war, although apparently Captain America sold really, really, really well. Yeah, I don't know what else to say, so I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. If you're going to look into the history of things, it would, be a good idea. You want to learn about the context of stuff before you just start proclaiming that, Captain America would be happy with you punching, Richard Spencer or whatever, because that's definitely not something I believe. I'm, one of those weird people who thinks that you shouldn't defraud people, steal from people, or attack them, whether that's, with unprovoked violence, or attack their character and try to harm them, just because they don't agree with you on everything, or even because they say nasty things. And I think Captain America would agree with me. And all the instances where Cap and Bucky are, dealing out crazy damage and vicious attacks against people, it's because people are directly, attacking them and threatening their lives or the lives of other innocent people. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up and get out of here, and I hope that you join me next time for when I talk about Fantastic Four issue number 2. As I continue to explore Marvel Comics, characters and books and stories, and try to go through in chronological order to really capture the feel of what it would have been like to be a Marvel consumer or fan or whatever you want to call it at the time, and how it changes over history. I just want to relive Marvel history, basically, because I find so much of it compelling. And if there's stuff I don't like, I'll probably not pay too much attention to it, but so far I'm being entertained by everything that I've read so far. So I'm going to keep that up. Anyway, learn history, a timeline of World War II. That's what you want to look up if you want to know a little bit more about what was going on, with the publishing of these books relative to the U.S. involvement in World War II. Thanks for sticking with me. Check out mgmunoz.com for more of my work. I'm an aspiring author who will gladly accept your financial support through coffee, or you can buy merch from my Redbubble store. Swinging Through Comics can be found on YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and mgmunoz.com/STC. Relevant links are in the show notes. If you had a good time, like and share this. Subscribe and ring that bell to catch me next time I'm swinging through comics.